There's so much to become when you're not throttled by this terrible, all these memories that in effect become your identity for a lot of people. And I think that's too bad. Trauma takes away so much from people, and it doesn't have to be that way. And I won't try to compare everybody. When people say everybody has trauma, I disagree. What I'm talking about is things that change your neurology. They make it hard to process. And I heard you say that you were always attracted to what was familiar, and that is definitely part of it. But there's also a brain injury that happens from trauma that makes it so the reasoning part of your brain isn't even firing when you're under stress. So it's not like you're choosing to go to something familiar. It's that you can't think. And emotions are going just fine, even like over the top. That part's going strong under stress when you had early trauma and you're walking around with that I call it a neurological injury. That's my word for it.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the podcast. I am delighted to be joined today with my guest, Anna Runkle. Anna is a trauma survivor turned coach and educator, best known under the moniker, the Crappy Childhood Fairy. Her work focuses on helping adults who grew up with childhood trauma, particularly what she calls childhood PTSD or complex PTSD stemming from early life stress, to understand their symptoms, regulate their nervous systems and build more fulfilling lives. Anna's work has attracted a very large following. Her great YouTube channel in particular has more than 970,000 followers. She hosts a podcast, the Crappy Childhood Fairy podcast with Anna Runkle, available on Spotify and other platforms. And she's authored books such as Re-Regulated, Set Your Life Free from Childhood PTSD and the Trauma-Driven Behaviours That Keep You Stuck. And her new book, Connectability, Heal the Hidden Ways You Isolate, Find Your People and Feel at Last Like You Belong, from Hay House, which is available now. I'm looking forward to talking all things trauma, healing and connection in general in today's show. Anna, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Brian. So nice to meet you.
Anna, I'm very excited for this conversation, and we're going to go in a whole host of different directions because the work you're doing is such a transformative impact on people's lives. But before we go into the specifics, I'm going to use your Instagram bio as our jumping off point because it'll give a little bit of an introductory for those who are unfamiliar with your work. To quote directly what you've written, I teach people how to recognize and heal adult symptoms of early trauma. Can you talk to us a little bit about this? Because your whole moniker when it comes to serving people and supporting them with the Crappy Childhood Fairy and putting a very positive spin and not getting stuck on our narrative, get stuck on our story, is what I'm taking away heavily from your work. But can you explain to us a little bit about how you recognize and help people heal that adult trauma from early life?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm showing people what helped me. And it was a little over 30 years ago when I was really hitting bottom with my own trauma symptoms. And it's not that I didn't know what had happened to me or that it was affecting me, but at that time in the world, there wasn't this concept of complex PTSD or dysregulation. And so when I sought help from therapists, the sort of going, the popular way of treating everything back then was talk about it. And, even today, that's a big truism. Oh, you need to talk to somebody. You need to explore these memories and these feelings and feel your feelings. Well, the thing is, I had very normal trauma symptoms like emotional dysregulation, and the advice to feel my feelings or always trust my gut was the worst advice in the world. And so I had severe symptoms going on and was going to therapy 3 times a week to talk about it. And the doctor was putting me on Xanax to cope with how stressed that was making me. And we now know for many, many people who are traumatized, talking about trauma is not the best thing. I think we all have to do it at some point. It's an important part of healing, but it's not, the solution doesn't lie there, in my opinion and experience. It becomes more about taking positive actions to change your life, because if you grew up with trauma, you have so many trauma-driven behaviors and habits and thinking and beliefs, and it really can get in your way.
Anna, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but something I heard you speak about on a podcast was not staying tethered to the same emotional position, that you don't deny your past, but stop using it as a lens for every new situation in your life. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, I learned some techniques that happened to help me heal 30 years ago. And I started going to the 12-step program for families of alcoholics. My whole family was alcoholic, addicted. Somehow I didn't inherit that, but I sure was affected by everything that was going on in the home. And we had all the problems that go along with that, of poverty, violence, discord. neglect, abuse sometimes. So I went to this program called Al-Anon. It's fantastic. And I learned a whole bunch of stuff about what alcoholism really is. And that program has this idea that you should really bring the focus on yourself. You understand what it is, but there was sort of this idea that we get sucked into these other people's problems, and it just starts to like run your whole life. And you end up with this deep belief, like, if I could just get them to change, I'd be happy. And many people, I don't know, my family never got sober, so I didn't have that direct experience of finding out what I would be like if they did. But I saw many people around me. It didn't change a lot just when other people changed. That we've ended up now with this problem inside, and this is where the focus belongs. And it's on recognizing where you're making a mistake and taking consistent positive action to make a change. And that, I think, is very underrated in our culture. People talk about it in terms of food or fitness, but not so much about emotional problems or relationships. And so that became my path in life, and that made me very popular as a 12-step sponsor. But when I learned about trauma, I had to take it out of that format, because it was no longer about anybody else's drinking. It was about this brain injury, this neurological injury that we now know happens as a result of early trauma. And I wanted to talk directly to people who related to me on that. I had no idea there would be so many. So I started a blog. I put some videos on YouTube to explain my writing technique, and it just took off. I was completely taken by surprise. So it was this very busy side hustle I had. Not even a hustle. I was helping people for free for 20, 25 years. And then it just sort of took over my life and became my whole job. I had to let go of I had a video production company, all of that. I just let go of everything, and this became my calling. And I was able to show people what I had noticed. I think what I wanted to say about spending 25 years going to many, many 12-step meetings is I could see like who gets better and who doesn't. And I was just paying attention to how they were choosing to, use the tools or not. And I just saw people who stay very focused on what other people did, which is very compelling. It's like hypnotic. They did this and they did this and I felt this. It's not that it's not important, but it can really just suck you in and become the whole reality. And there's no door. There's no exit from there. The exit happens when you go, but what was I doing in that relationship in the first place? What is it that compelled me to overlook the red flags and stick around and keep trying to work that out and abandon myself and, give up my friendships and stop talking to people who cared about me? What was that? That's when I started to get better.
There's a quiz on your website about, is your past trauma affecting your dating life, which I'm actually going to link in the description for people, because that can be very illuminating. Because what I found, and again, I'm not the expert, but focus group of one here, that I found that I would tend to relive in romantic relationships some of the things that were quite familiar to me in early life: a disconnection, a not really feeling loved. Again, I had a great relationship with my mother. Historically, not a very good relationship with my father, although it's been transformed over the last decade, but historically it wasn't very good. And that led me to seeking out the familiarity versus the things that are good for me in a relationship that felt familiar to me. The disconnection, the pulling away, the loneliness, the isolation, those feelings that, again, as I mentioned, didn't necessarily serve me, but they were familiar, so it was what I was attracted to. I want to ask, you mentioned there about what people do that's right and what people do that's wrong. And I've spoken on this podcast a lot about trauma. It's something that I had to do a lot of work on, years of therapy. I've spoken about early childhood sexual abuse, stuff that for me was deeply ingrained in my shadow, that I did not want to face, did not want to look at, and it manifested itself in a whole host of negative behaviours. It reminds me of that Carl Jung quote, that until you make the subconscious conscious, it'll rule your life and you'll call it fate. That's how I moved through the world, not seeking and going deeper to try and work through the thing that was helping me move forward to the life direction that I was supposed to be in. It wasn't until I hit my 30s and a few years after my daughter was born, I got a bit of a wake-up call on that. From your experience, either personally or from all the people you've helped over the years, what are some of the differentiators between those who have suffered early childhood trauma, from small t trauma to big T trauma, that are able to, I won't say make it serve them, but at least let go and remove some of the intensity from the story so that it's not impacting their life in a negative way now, versus those who can't?
Well, the method I teach has to do with writing, a very specific and sort of prayerful form of writing that's for expressing what all the fearful and resentful thoughts and feelings are and getting them on paper and asking for them to be removed. When we do it, it's not so much that it never comes back, but there's a little space. Like we have a perfectly good brain in there that can interpret reality, but it's very clogged and cluttered. Scientifically, early trauma makes it very hard to process thoughts and feelings. So it literally is like a big cluttered, a hoarder house in there of things that have happened and how we feel about it. We haven't been able to move it down the assembly line to where it's just a memory. It's not activating a bunch of stress hormones every time we think about it. And there's space and there's perception. There's often a lot of stuff to overcome too from a rough childhood. If you were, manipulated, lied to, scolded for stupid things like speaking, there's a lot to overcome there. But it comes down to, now I know there's some different approaches to come at this stuff. For me, it was thoughts and feelings. That's what was really the problem. And so just to continually sort of take a thought and feeling shower and get them out on paper without talking about them, which can be extremely triggering. And even when you're like for me, when I was going to talk therapy for so many years, I would get all this support and empathy for what I was saying, but it would kind of like be a magnet to draw me back into the feelings. I don't think they were trying to make me relive anything, but just dwelling on that stuff week after week ended up being really toxic for me. It was just never a good place. There was no answer there. There was no insight to be gained about why were they so selfish and cruel. It happened. And so I'm grateful I had a chance to tell people about it in many forums, but I'm also grateful I found a better way to express it so that it wasn't just a big invitation to go back into it. It was just it's kind of like, if you remember before smartphones, if somebody told you their phone number, you had to repeat it to yourself, or you'd forget. And it's kind of like that. If you could just write it down, you could go there. It's written down. Or nowadays you could have somebody type it into your phone and you don't have to sit there and memorize anything. And it's freeing and you have space to think about other things. There's so much to become when you're not throttled by this terrible, all these memories that in effect become your identity for a lot of people. And I think that's too bad. Trauma takes away so much from people, and it doesn't have to be that way. And I won't try to compare everybody. When people say everybody has trauma, I disagree. What I'm talking about is things that change your neurology. They make it hard to process. And I heard you say that you were always attracted to what was familiar, and that is definitely part of it. But there's also a brain injury that happens from trauma that makes it so the reasoning part of your brain isn't even firing when you're under stress. So it's not like you're choosing to go to something familiar. It's that you can't think. And emotions are going just fine, even like over the top. That part's going strong under stress when you had early trauma and you're walking around with that I call it a neurological injury. That's my word for it. But we know, it's a real injury because we know that people who were traumatized as kids have very elevated risks for heart disease, cancer, diabetes, obesity, reproductive disorders, autoimmune diseases, depression, anxiety, addiction. There's hardly anything that isn't made worse by trauma. It does do something to you that's not under your conscious control. And sometimes I like to remind people it's not all psychological. That, when a girl who has been sexually abused will go into puberty an average of 2 years earlier than her peers. So that she didn't choose that. She's not doing something familiar. There's something that has changed. And many people suspect, and I'm very curious about all the research coming out, this has a lot to do with the way that our bodies handle insulin and fat and carbohydrates and how we sleep and it's certainly, and this comes back to clearly psychological too, is the way we connect with other people. So if a child is neglected in early childhood, there is part of the neurological development that's been inhibited. And maybe some people are more resilient than others. It's a mystery why some people are affected more than their sibling in the same family. We're all different, but we do know that it's called developmental trauma for a reason. It affects how everything wires up and creates your capacity to have intuition, to feel connected to people, to be able to do this thing called trusting your gut. Like that's not there if it didn't develop. So I like to go on faith that we have a great deal of flexibility, and some injuries are like a scrape and you will heal because it's natural to heal. If you can keep it clean and put a bandage on it, it's going to heal. I think some of our early childhood wounds are like that. Some things are like an amputation. You're not going to have a new limb, but you may be able to get a prosthetic. You may be able to find a workaround that makes it so you can function as if you didn't have that injury in many ways and do the best you can. And that's what a lot of us are doing, is the best we can with what we have. So once, when I heard the name dysregulation, it just blew my mind, because I had been dysregulated so much of my life. And it like right there, learning that word for what it is, this feeling of discombobulation, can't quite feel everything, spacing out, emotionally having these huge reactions to things that are this big with a reaction this big. That's what damages relationships. And so I just thought I was like a bad person. But when I understood what dysregulation was, and that everybody gets dysregulated, but people who were abused and neglected, and interestingly, neglect is maybe one of the worst things causing it, they're more prone to dysregulation than your average person, more prone. So we go into it easier, we stay there longer, it's a little more intense, it's harder to get out of. So we teach ourselves to notice when it's happening and come back out of it. And the like master's degree level, you learn to just like, don't make any decisions, don't like say things right now, notice you're dysregulated, use your tools, get re-regulated, buy a little time, and then try to work out your problems with other people. And your whole life can go in a completely new path that way.
Anna, can I ask you about the difference between abuse and neglect? Because people that have been listening to this podcast, and we have a very big listenership, will be very familiar with the big T traumas, the little d traumas, the ideology or the realization that nobody comes through childhood unscathed. We all pick up stuff from parental figures, mothers, fathers, or substitute parental figures, teachers, etc. We don't have the tools in that early life generally to handle the emotional intelligence that we would have as an adult that potentially you would have used when we were 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. Neglect, as you mentioned there, can be just as dangerous because it leads to that disconnection. It leads to an inability to connect with other individual, your children, your partner, your loved ones at a deeper level. Can you talk to us a little bit about how neglect manifests itself in adult behavior? And then we'll unpack, you've got a very popular video, the 3 CPTSD behaviors that push people away on YouTube, that I want to unpack. But can you talk to us a little bit about how neglect manifests or shows up for adults, so we have a grounding before we get into those behaviors that push people away?
There are many people who are licensed and have studied this in depth, and I've read their work. Mostly what I'm informed by is my observation. I've known many people who were both abused and neglected, and I was both, but mostly neglected. My brother was mostly abused. Just in my own family, we had some differences there. But neglect is harder for a child to recognize the injustice of it. It's easier, even if you're 5, to know that a parent's being unfair when they're being abusive. That's not guaranteed. But even a 2-year-old, I have 2 kids who are young men now. And I just remember being so impressed that they could barely talk and they were in diapers, but they knew when something was not fair. Well, look at that. Humans have this intrinsic sense of fairness. But neglect, I don't think, highlights itself as an injustice. We take it very personally. It's all we know. And it can leave some very strange quirks in there. The therapist Pete Walker, who wrote a really important book about complex PTSD called Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. I read that early on and it blew my mind. And he came up with 2 concepts that are really important to know. One is emotional flashbacks. We've seen movies about war veterans who have the combat type of flashback that we, grew up learning was associated with PTSD, regular post-traumatic stress disorder. Complex PTSD is a kind of PTSD that comes from chronic, ongoing, intense exposure to stress, like neglect and or abuse or bullying in school. It doesn't always just happen in the home, and it doesn't always happen in childhood. but mostly it does. There's a big neurological development window there where it can affect you very much. Whereas an adult, you might have a little more, I don't know, a way out of being so affected by certain experiences. You might. But an emotional flashback is sort of like that, except you have no memory of what is this about. So this feeling washes over you, very strong, very dire, full of rage and grief and panic and it's coming over you, and there's no memory of going, oh, this is, ever since this happened, I get this feeling sometimes. You don't associate it with anything. It's from pre-verbal times. When I heard that word, I knew exactly what it was in me. I get these things where I get this, all the feelings come, and the belief is, I have to do everything, don't I? I'm this unique person who has to do everything for everyone, and no one ever has to lift a finger. And I'm so persecuted. I'm not making fun of myself. I expect that was a feeling I had when I was 2. That, the problems in my home were so severe, I probably wasn't getting diaper changes and food when I needed them, or cuddles, or anybody coming in when I was crying. There was probably a lot of that, I can assume. And so this feeling comes back sometimes. And what it looks like to me in adulthood is I wake up. It tends to come when I wake up. My husband's there in bed next to me. And I look at him and I'm like, it's that guy. It's that guy who never does anything. That's why I feel this way. He makes me feel this way. And it's just this terrible source of discord. And before we were married, every relationship I had, I would get this like feeling. And it's a terribly unfair thing to do to somebody because they can't fix it. Even if it was their fault, they can't fix it. Nobody can fix this thing that happened to you. And so a change in relationships can happen when we know that a movie is being projected onto real time right now, and we might not be totally getting the facts straight. That's why I say this, trust your gut, always feel your feelings. It's not always the best advice because there is this like overlay sometimes, and it's very emotional, and it's really hard to tell the difference. Later, it'll sort of dissipate. You can go, I'm really sorry. I'm sorry I lost my temper. I'm sorry I laid into you about, the chores. And because normally what he would say is something like, but I did do that, but I was going to finish the other part today, but okay, I'm sorry it was late. But nothing can answer the emotional flashback. There's nothing he can do that makes me feel like, oh, okay, he gets it. When it's on a person, it feels very real. And so I just think Pete Walker's contribution was tremendous in being able to help us understand that, because finally you go, okay, so normal people advice about what to do about conflict and feelings might be a little different for me because sometimes I see a movie. And the other thing he came up with is something called abandonment melange. And that French word melange, like a big mess. and for people who have had abandonment wounds, and I definitely did as a little one, this thing can come over you where it's, again, the terrible emotional cocktail. And it's so severe that it feels like the only possible course of action is to hang on for dear life. And so even if you're in a terrible relationship, even an abusive relationship, you'll first have the thought, I got to get out of here. Then the abandonment melange floods in. And it's like, no way, I can never make it without this person. Everyone hates me. It just starts to inform your mind with these thoughts. And it will make people, stay in relationships year after year when people are always like, why doesn't she leave? That's why there's a really strong emotional thing that comes over and controls you and makes it seem it's not a real thought. It is difficult to leave a relationship, and there are many logistical and safety considerations, and it's painful. That's all real. But this thing that you'll die, that you'll never have anything outside of this relationship is an illusion brought on by old trauma. And no one can reason with you about it. They have a track record of not really understanding your trauma in the past. Why should you believe them now? And the hard thing is that a person with these kind of relational wounds from childhood of being neglected, abandoned, abused, is the attachment wound. I think most your dear listeners know all about attachment styles and attachment wounds. If you have an attachment wound that makes you attach instantly to people the second it feels like, something is attractive about them, then people can end up rushing in. And I say people. I've done it. I've done it more than once, rushing into a relationship with thinking I'm thinking clearly, and then very quickly realizing, oh no, this is ridiculous. I got to get out of here now. And then abandonment melange comes and I can't. I just can't. I'll die. And so I lost years of my life just trapped in that cycle again and again and again. And even if I were to date somebody pretty nice and could have worked out well, these old wounds would come back and kind of make things rocky and difficult for us, and it wouldn't work out. And so it was very sad, very tragic. And a lot of my potential in relationships, but also in work and creativity, was so held back by these tendencies. And we didn't have the words for it. And I was intelligent. I was working so hard to change my life. And really just learning about what those things are, I was able to put it together for myself and change course and handle these difficulties differently and make rules for myself. When I notice I'm dysregulated, which I can tell in my case because my nose feels numb and I get this sense of urgency, like I have to make everybody understand why I'm upset. I have to make them understand right now. Half understanding is not enough for me. Tomorrow is too late. It has to be now, and it has to be 100%. It's a bullying position, you know? It doesn't work. And so I learned that if I'm having that thought, it means pull back, say something gracious like, hi, I feel like I'm getting kind of intense. Can I take a break and go, get my head together and continue this conversation later? Because I really want to know what you're saying. And I don't want to mess this up. And people will say, oh, well, this is a whole different reaction than, ah, la, la, la. And now repair is possible. Now a better way forward can appear on the horizon. Your choices array themselves in front of you for the first time ever. Oh, you have choices. You can leave, you can yell, you can not say anything, you can work it out. They are all choices.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Anna. I want to ask, because that's going to resonate with a lot of people in real time. What you've done there and what I'm hearing is you've found a way to bring awareness to a emotional reaction that's creating enough space and a stopgap between the event happening and the reaction, and then what I call trying to put the broken glass back together. It's like you can knock a cup or glass on the floor and you can say sorry, but it doesn't unbreak the glass. And again, a lot of stuff, words, experiences that we move through can feel like that. I want to ask about your check-in for that. So for me personally, one of my check-ins for triggers and activations has always been, if it's hysterical, it's historical. That's my, okay, I am disproportionately reacting to this event that my partner said, that my daughter said, that something happened. I need to check in with this. This is a Brian Keane problem. I need to breathe into this, sit into this, and don't react and respond, i.e. emotionally, figuratively, metaphorically breaking that glass. Do you have a check-in for even the emotional flashback there, or where something happens with a partner or a loved one in work and you're like, you feel it. It's like, I always think Jekyll and Hyde. It's like it's surging up and somebody else is taking control of the steering wheel temporarily. Do you have a check-in for when that happens? Because a lot of people listening will get aha moments, light bulb moments as you were speaking, going, oh wow, I do that. That happens to me. Do you have something that serves, that is a transition or 0 to 1 to the stopgap that brings awareness to that check-in before, metaphorically all hell breaks loose?
Yeah. The twin techniques that saved my life 30 years ago when I was overwhelmed with trauma symptoms. And I think you would have seen this in my book, that I always had childhood trauma, but it got really bad when a specific adult trauma happened. I was attacked on the streets and beaten unconscious. And the help I got was thorough from doctors and therapists, but it was not a fit for me. All the talk, and take drugs. I had PTSD, and I was severely dysregulated, and there was no help available for that. The first order of business is to get re-regulated, because if you're overreacting to something, and I know many people will say it's not an overreaction, and I both understand what you mean, and I want to tell you, yes, it is. It's It is. It's not going to work. It's too much for the situation and nobody can fix it. So first we go within. There are some very quick emergency measures you can do. You say, okay, I'm having a reaction right now. I'm getting dysregulated. Then you get yourself some time. If you had to do one thing, I would say move your body. Sometimes just moving your body will help you come back to present time a little bit, out of the historical, out of the sort of time traveling or emotional sort of hypnosis. It's like being in a trance, I'd say, when you're very, very dysregulated. It's like you're in a trance. Got to come out of it. Literally shaking your body can help you come out of the trance. A cold shower. So these are just emergency measures. But the thing that I've done every day, twice a day, since my life was saved in these techniques is I get my fears and resentments on paper and ask them to remove. This is all in writing. I almost always tear it up immediately afterwards. This is not a journal. This is not me trying to analyze anything. It's just me, I'm resentful so-and-so because I have fear they're doing this to me. I get it out. I don't have to judge it. I don't have to figure out the solution. I just name it. This is what's bothering me. And it turns out there's a lot of scientific reasoning why it is so therapeutic to write. It can be a very positive alternative to speaking, which is often what we try to do with other people or in therapy. So writing is better. Now, somatic healing, there's this whole thing where you can do things with your body. That's one way. I just call this cognitive dysregulation. It's cognitive dysregulation. So many thoughts and feelings, and writing it out one thought at a time, one feeling at a time. It just sort of, it's like a balloon. It's getting out. It's finally getting out. Whereas for me, talking about it was making the balloon bigger until it popped. So this is letting it out. And for people inclined towards a sort of prayerful or higher power or universe orientation where you're asking for it to be removed, if you really don't, that's not what you're into, you can release it if you dare. I'm just not good at that personally. So I'm glad that my friend who showed this to me sort of said, why don't you try appealing to God to do it? And at the time I was just like, that's so stupid. She's like, but look at you. You're like, I mean, I really thought I had to end my life at that time. She's like, why don't you just ask? And she was very credible to me because she was happy and she had lived on the streets before. And she was happy and functional and very bright and shiny as a person. Bonnie, as you might say over there, and so I was like, all right, I'll do it. And I did end up believing in God because the transformation happened so fast after years of struggling in therapy. And then this acute crisis after I was assaulted where I was getting worse, not better. I recovered from both depression and the PTSD symptoms in about 2 weeks. So it would have been nice if that was the end of the story and everything was happily ever after. But what comes after that is now you can begin to start solving your life problems. I had problems with money, men, friends, work, health, everything. As a chain smoker, I had a lot of things that took more time to undo. But once I had these techniques, she said, use this twice a day. You do this writing and you follow it with a restful meditation for 20 minutes. And I used to think that was just something that was tacked on for looks. But over the last 31 years, I've been learning more and more about the research that's come out. Writing can be very therapeutic, but if you only write, you're sort of like, whatever that's doing can be exhausting and you'll give up after a while. That's what I notice in people. People can last about a month if they're not meditating using my technique. So I go, come on, you got to start meditating. So I get people meditating right away. It can be very simple. You just put your feet up, close your eyes, rest, use a mantra word if you like. No verbs, no goals, no like, I will be the best, public.
I'm the best trauma person to deal with it. I've worked through.
Yeah. I will get 1 million subscribers. It's actually coming, but it's nothing like that. That's not the mantra. It's not that kind of thing. And so if for us, you could, I originally learned a Sanskrit word that means nothing. That worked nicely. Or if people just want a handy word, okay, or this, just the most neutral word that's not any pressure on you to like make stuff go anywhere. That's the hardest thing when I'm teaching it, is to try to help people understand they can let go. Just let go. Just like, let this happen. Get it on paper. Ask for it to be removed. Take a rest and just see what happens. But a lot of people go, well, I want to also infuse this with gratitude at the end of it. And I'm like, that's a good idea, but you don't have to do that. When you have less fear and resentment, gratitude is just sitting there, right? You're just filled with it. Mm-hmm. And so is acceptance, and so is kindness, and all this good stuff that's actually part of our human nature that's been suppressed under all the fear and resentment will start to show its face. And over time, doing it a long time, I have so many more of these qualities. available to me and as my natural state, and less of the old ones. I still get fearful. I still get resentful. Still a human, but I know what to do. I know what to do. So I just stay on it. And a lot of people do it like in a pinch. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But to really get the effect of change, of transformation twice a day, to just start to trust the process. I'm just going to keep rinsing this stuff off and let it go. And then people say, well, it came back the next day. I'm like, oh yeah, totally. It does that. You still feel like you're not pretty enough. Guess what? And so you write it again. You just write it as many days as you have to. And even if that's for the rest of your life, that's okay, because you're getting a little space from that. You're getting a little capacity to have some real here now awareness of things. And a lot of that self-attack or resentment at others and anxiety about the future and belief like, oh, I'm broken forever. I'll never have a good relationship after what happened to me. All of that, this is a practical way to hold these things lightly, not to push them down, not to deny them, but it's just like, I'm putting them over here and I'm having space to just be here. And remarkably, for me, my recovery was quite fast. And while all those years I was sitting in 12-step rooms, I was just watching the different speeds that people go at for different reasons. And I think some people are really in resistance to it, and other people are trying really hard. But I just found that my daily practice just helped me always kind of be, doing well at the marathon of life, moving forward, learning my lessons quickly. That's what we do. We make mistakes. We learn. We dust ourselves off. We keep going. If you don't have a way to treat all the emotional, backwash that happens when you don't know how to handle your dysregulation and your pain, then you give up. You're just like, well, I can't do that again. I'll just avoid people. I'll just be alone forever. I will never try for a promotion. I will never, go out and sit in the park by myself and read a book because people are awful. And there's just so much of that. So you get stuck. You get limited by your own trauma symptoms like that. Some people do it in grand ways, like be a hermit. Other people do it in a covert way that I call covert avoidance, where maybe they get somebody who marries them, but they never allow them to be close, or they always are looking at their phone at dinner, or they're just so busy. I'm sort of telling on myself here.
We're our own best examples, and I know the new book particularly goes through this, the connectability and healing those hidden ways that people isolate. But I want to ask as an example, because you have a few really good points there. One of the brain tattoos that I have, my mother gave me when I was very young, was that when you stop chasing the wrong things, you give the right things an opportunity to catch up. And it came back to me there in real time with the resentment and fear, those low frequency emotions that can sometimes feel like they're waves and overwhelming. When you start to maneuver through or transcend some of that, you end up giving gratitude, acceptance, kindness, love, peace an opportunity to catch up. So it's a bit of a catch-22, as opposed to I want this. It's actually I'm a nutritionist, fitness person, so generally with people be like, oh, what food will I eat? I'm like, sometimes the answer is, okay, what food should you remove? Like if you're eating McDonald's 3 times a day, you'll actually be better just removing the really highly processed stuff you're eating, and then by proxy you'll end up eating healthier. Sometimes emotions can feel similar. If you can minimize the amount of negative emotions coming up, you end up letting these higher vibration frequencies come to the forefront. But I want to use that as an example, because you have a great, I can't remember if it was a YouTube or a podcast. It was definitely something I read and listened to in the lead up to this about it was why every woman feels like they're not enough. But I think this is a gender neutral topic. I know this is something I really, really struggled with. So can I use the example you mentioned there about resentment, fear, and, the writing principles for someone that struggles with not being enough? Is the process, if we're following the methodology or the modality that you've recommended, to write the positive affirmation on the other side? Is it to clear a stream of consciousness thought to why we feel resentment and fear, why we don't feel enough? What does that process look like?
No, you don't write positive affirmations. You could do that at a separate time if that's helpful. But there's no need to do a positive affirmation, because that's what I call grabbing the handlebars. You think you know what you need to believe right now, but let's just be agnostic a minute and just surrender the fear and resentment and discover what you know right now. Just let it come to you. That's the hardest thing to teach people. We've all had to work so very hard just to cope, just to get along, just to not end up in the streets. We've had to work so hard. It's hard to believe that for this, we're just going to let it be done to us by naming it, releasing it, taking a rest. It's counterintuitive, but you have to try it to believe it. And then to do it twice a day for a week, people would begin to get a feeling of like, do you remember the movie Contact with Jodie Foster? Did you ever
Oh,
see that?
a very long time ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's this scene in it. She sort of gets instructions from outer space on how to build a spaceship and go see the other people. She doesn't know what's going to happen. Will it blow up? Will she die? Is it just a trick? Is it, what is it? But she just has faith. She builds the spaceship and she follows all the instructions except one. They don't make sense to human engineering. But one of them is there's no seatbelt. And she thinks there has to be a seatbelt. It's not safe to blast off into space without a seatbelt. So they put it on. And when she pushes the button to activate it, the ship starts shaking so hard, it's about to break her body into pieces. And it's shaking so hard. And so finally she takes off the seatbelt and then she just floats effortlessly up. It's like that. Sometimes you actually don't have to like hold on or hold steering wheel and make it go to gratitude. Maybe gratitude is not the feeling right now. Maybe the consciousness that's coming up to you is some different thing right now, and you just let it happen and trust. Like if you do this twice a day, all the beautiful colors of your being will present themselves to you, as well as all the things that need to be visited. Because that's the second thing that people find hard to believe with this technique. And this is not a therapy. Some people go to therapy too. In fact, many therapists use this technique and give it to their clients. So this is not saying that you can't do anything else. But if you do this twice a day, the past will come and visit you sooner or later, or the anxieties you have about the future. So no digging. The thing that makes it very upsetting to people is they are used to going in and going, the 100 things that ever happened to me. And that will just upset you. That's not going to be this. You just write whatever it happens to be. And usually at any given sitting, what's bothering you is a couple of awful memories, one from childhood, one from yesterday, a worry about the future that's very serious, like cancer, a worry about the future that's like, did I mail the rent? Did I... What's in the fridge? What am I going to eat? And I look terrible. And so there's just this, a mix of like self-hatred, hatred of others, fear about everything not being suitable. And you just, whatever it is, you put it down. And you never have to go in and make a comprehensive list of anything. Because if you do it twice a day, it comes. This is probably the most I've ever explained how to do it verbally on a podcast. I'm going to give you a link to the free course. It's also in my books of how to do it. And it's very nuanced. These things that I'm cautioning, it's like, it's very hard for people to really grasp that you don't add anything to it. You really only have to rest. You don't have to create an affirmation at the end going, make me awesome, or help me to be divinely loving and kind to all people. Nothing. You don't have to change a thing. There's nothing that needs to be changed about you while you do this. And you open your mind. I don't know where this is going. And so I often tell people, well, why don't you write and meditate and see what happens? And people will often hear that as dismissive. And I'm like, no, I'm telling you the secret. See what happens. You can't predict it. It will show you.
And I want to echo and speak to that firsthand, because what's so interesting, and we've had completely different life paths, and people listening will have different life paths that they're following, some consciously, subconsciously, and everything in between. But something that I resonate heavily with your work is the one, not living in the trauma and constantly revisiting it. This was something that I did for way too long. It's way longer than I care to admit, that I thought reliving, going back, and then either rewriting the story, which definitely removes some of the intensity when you write alternative versions of the stuff that happened, that feels like the intensity is too strong and holding you back. When you're able to get to that breathing space, can be beneficial. But focusing on learning to lift your mood, focusing on a non-attachment of what comes up from the past and from the future, and sitting with it and surrendering into it. And it's so interesting on a podcast, as people will probably gather, and Anna, you can connect with this, that the secret is the see what happens, see what comes up. And for so long, my type A personality was, give me the practical answers. What's the therapy? What's the practice? What's the modality? What's the answer? And if it was that straightforward, we wouldn't be having this conversation. People wouldn't be struggling with trauma, neglect. We haven't figured out. The solution would be there.
There'd
Where
be no podcasts.
there'd be no podcast. That is, we would just be bouncing back and forth, chatting about tiddlywinks and cryptocurrency. It'd be just a totally different thing. So what's so interesting about it is it's sitting into that and surrendering into it. And I'm going to link up. I've got one final question. Before I do that, I'm going to link up the new book, Connectability. That's going to be very heavily influential for those who are struggling with isolation. They're struggling with loneliness. They want to find their tribe. They want to find their people. And I'm also going to link up Re-Regulated. So this is setting yourself free from that childhood PTSD. The stuff we talked about earlier on in the podcast. Big book readers on this podcast. There's potentially both angles that people can come at. Go with the one that connects with you most now. If you're struggling with connectability, that's going to be the read. If you're struggling with childhood PTSD, then obviously go with Re-Regulated to start. And I will link the quizzes and website and everything else that we've mentioned in today's podcast. But before I ask the final question, you've got some new things on the horizon as well with the coaching programs, etc. Is there anywhere else you'd like to send people off the back of this podcast before I get into the final question?
Well, I think YouTube is where the world met me. And that's, I publish 5 videos a week. So you can always find out what's on my mind there. And then I lead a series of retreats throughout the year, and they can come to my website. I have courses. I do a webinar every month, coaching programs. So there's a lot of ways to connect with these lessons. And the website's also called crappychildhoodfairy.com.
Amazing. And I will link those in the description for people so they can check it out off the back of this podcast. The final question I want to ask is a lot more practical. And I would argue 95% of people still struggle with it, a past version of myself included. And that's how to stop caring what people think about you, and that nothing will drain your strength faster. Without opening Pandora's box on a final question, because you have content that covers this, I want to bookend and wrap the podcast, because everything we've mentioned in this episode and all the amazing tools you've given Anna, on top of the resources with quizzes and books, etc., sometimes the block can be, well, what will people think if I try and do this work? What will people think if I have to lean into my trauma? What will people think if I'm trying to heal? Particularly Irish and UK individuals, large portions of this podcast, we have a little bit of a just get on with it attitude, which is what I try and break with this podcast, that accept yourself for where you're at. Remove the external input from people. If there's a journey and a path you need to follow to live the life you were put here to live, and I think stopping caring what people think about is a big factor for that, and how it drains people's strength, drains their energy. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, and we'll wrap on this?
Well, this is like an unhealthy caring what people think about you, and that's basically because we have an underdeveloped sense of self, and we don't have access to our inner power at all. And so we become just incredibly dependent on people affirming us and validating us to even feel real. And it's a huge problem. And I don't know of any way to directly come at that except to start just, getting rid of the fear and resentment that you're no damn good. And I use those techniques, and it came. I used to hear all sorts of platitudes. You can't love anybody till you love yourself. So love yourself, girl. And I'd be like, how? I don't love myself. You just say, love yourself. Like, that's the most useless advice I ever had. But as I began to get free of all the self-attack, one of my resentments was like against myself. What's under there is love of self and love of others. But this advice that you should just be yourself and not care what other people think, there's this other side of the coin that is about being considerate about others, being kind, patient, tolerant, all of these virtues. That can also be called, that's like the positive way of caring what other people think or how my actions affect other people. And like so many people with trauma, I wasn't very good at that when my trauma was controlling my life. I wasn't very sensitive to other people. My trauma was very loud. And I was just grasping at straws, trying to feel better. And so I couldn't be thoughtful. So what set me free also to confidently be myself, even when my opinions are different. I have to do a lot of standing out and being different, or taking criticism as you do online, doing something like you do and I do. People will say vicious things, but it it hurts less because I'm very conscientious about being a good person. And I've worked very hard to set my mistakes right and to pay attention. And I read philosophy and theology, and I have worked hard to be a considerate and kind person as best I can. And now that can come a little more naturally to me too. So I'm not so inhibited when I have to react in the moment and say, hey, get away, or shut up. I can do that and be like, oh, that's okay, because I know myself. It was time to say, shut up. And other times it's time to say, forgive me. Let me hear again what you said. And I just have a better sense of that. That's like that perception damage that happens to kids who are traumatized it just gets us so trapped in not either, total self-suppression or lashing out. There's like a switch on, off. And now it turns out there are choices. You get to decide how you want to handle something in a much better way. And it doesn't make you a doormat or a saint. It makes you a flexible person.
I love that. I think a beautiful way to wrap up that flexibility, that self-awareness, that, again, without being too cliche, coming back to who the real you is, which is such a probably overused line on podcasts, on YouTube, on social media, but finding out who you are, the real you, authentic you, because it clears away a lot of the crap and rubbish around it that was given to you, the stuff that's happened, the experientials, the biases that you see the world through because of childhood experiences, adult experiences, whether it's, some of the stuff you've mentioned on this podcast, which I'm so grateful you shared. When we clear that and remove that and you see what's left through all the tools and practices that you've given in today's podcast, it makes navigating the world a lot easier. Something that I've regularly said to people, I do a lot of work with people on their business, helping them with their fitness business, etc. When they're struggling with this negativity online, I'm like, nobody on their life path is spewing negativity online. You need to forgive the people who were confused and unhappy with where they're at, because if they were living in alignment and happy in their life, they're not going to be spewing negativity your way. I was like, sometimes you'll have pity for them. More times it's empathy, where you're like, oh, I feel for that person. I was confused once upon a time. I was unhappy once upon a time. I feel for that individual. And that just means that you can get your message out there and continue to do so. And Anna, thank you so much for your time, for the work that you do. And again, the YouTube channel in particular, that is just phenomenal. It is an amazing resource for people. So they'll check that out off the back of this, the podcast too, and the books. But Anna, keep doing what you're doing. And thank you so much again.
Thank you.
That was Anna Runkle, aka Crappy Childhood Fairy, talking about the journey to emotional regulation and healing and the hidden effects of neglect in childhood. Very thought-provoking podcast, again, going a lot deeper than some of the more recent topics that we've been covering. But as I mentioned at the top of the show, I've been trying to cover all aspects of wellness mindsets. So for everything from relationships, most importantly your relationship to yourself, and how that can potentially play a role with your nutrition, your fitness, and any physical goals, or even just financial or relationship goals that you set for yourself. So hopefully you got a lot from today's podcast. Let me know. That's everything from me from today's show. Thank you so much for listening. Catch you next Monday.